The Marlowe estate stood on the ridge like a sentinel watching over the rolling fields of Kentucky. Its whitewashed walls gleamed in the sun, its windows reflecting the sky as if nothing foul could ever enter. To the passing traveler, it was a picture of Southern grace, a home where the soil promised plenty and the family within promised honor. But to those who lived in its shadow, the house carried a weight, a silence too deliberate, a perfection that seemed to swallow sound itself. Neighbors said the estate was blessed, yet their voices lowered when they spoke of what lingered inside its history. Because blessings never came without a price, and the Marlowes paid theirs in a way no one dared to admit aloud. Every marriage in the family followed the same order, as steady as the tolling of a church bell. A daughter of the house wed, a new husband was brought into its gates, and for a short time life seemed to flourish. Neighbors would see couples walking by the orchard, hear faint laughter through the open shutters, or watch a newlywed husband tending to the horses with care. Yet as months passed, a darkness came upon them, first as small absences, a face no longer seen in town, a voice missing from the pews at church, an unfinished task left in the fields. Then without warning the man was gone. No funeral, no grave, no explanation beyond the widow's quiet composure and the family's patient nods. The pattern began to gnaw at those who watched from outside. A cousin married and vanished, then a brother-in-law, then another. With each disappearance, the Marlowe women dressed in black, not with grief, but with the serenity of those who have long rehearsed their roles. They appeared at services calm and unbroken, hands folded, voices steady, eyes never wet with tears. The town whispered that perhaps the Marlowe blood carried misfortune, that men simply could not thrive in that house. But others felt the truth pressing harder, that misfortune does not repeat with such precision unless it is planned, crafted by hands that never tremble. The estate itself seemed to enforce the silence. The fields around it grew rich crops, the orchards bloomed thick with fruit, and yet the air carried a stillness unnatural for land so alive. At night, neighbors spoke of hearing faint cracking sounds carried on the wind like wood splitting though no axe was swung, and sometimes a low humming that could not be traced to voice or instrument. A heavy smoke was seen drifting from the rear chimneys long after midnight, carrying a bitter stench that clung to the clothes of those who passed too near. The women of the house explained it as curing herbs for winter or burning old wood, and the town accepted it, because the truth was heavier than anyone wanted to carry. It was Lydia Marlowe who ruled the silence. Her presence was soft, her voice gentle, her manner filled with charity. She tended to the sick with her remedies, brewed teas for restless mothers, and sewed garments for children who had none. No one could reconcile the image of her kind hands with the rumors that followed her home. Yet beneath her calm eyes was a will sharper than any blade, a certainty that whatever was done within the walls of the estate was necessary. She spoke of order, of family, of traditions too sacred to question, and in her shadow the other women obeyed. The husbands became shadows not because they wished to leave, but because something in the house demanded their erasure. Each man seemed to wither in spirit before disappearing altogether. Their laughter grew strained, their bodies thin, their eyes dull with a weariness no sleep could cure. It was as if the house itself drew from them, feeding on their presence until nothing remained but an echo in the rooms they once filled. By the time they were gone, their absence seemed inevitable, as though they had never belonged to the earth at all. In town, some still spoke kindly of the Marlowes, saying sorrow had simply chosen them more cruelly than others. But those who had seen the smoke, who had smelled the burning that clung to the wind, carried a deeper fear. They felt that every vanished husband had not been taken by chance, but by something deliberate, something crafted with patience and ritual. They could not name it, but they sensed it lived in the cellar of that house on the hill, where silence was law and secrets were currency. And so the estate remained, gleaming white in the daylight, a monument to quiet prosperity. Yet each time a wedding carriage pulled up its drive, the neighbors looked away, hearts sinking. They knew what the bride would become, and what the husband would never live to be. For in the Marlowe family, love was a ceremony, marriage was a passage, and every union ended not with joy but with a widow who smiled too calmly, while the earth never received the body that should have followed. Lydia Marlowe moved through the world with a quiet grace that disarmed suspicion. In the church pews, she bowed her head with reverence, her lips moving softly in prayer. At market, she offered remedies to weary mothers, jars of dried herbs tied with twine, and tinctures that eased coughs or settled restless sleep. Her reputation was one of kindness and patience, a woman whose hands were made for healing and whose heart was stitched with charity. But beneath the surface of that calm exterior lived a mind that understood suffering in ways too precise, too deliberate to be called accidental. Her hands, which seemed so gentle when pressing cool cloths to fevered brows, had also learned to bind, to carve, to preserve. In the locked cellar beneath the estate, she kept her tools arranged with meticulous care. Vials of crushed minerals lined the shelves, powdered lead, quicksilver, arsenic ground to dust finer than flour. She told neighbors she studied old cures passed down through families of European descent, but the combinations she prepared were never meant to heal. They were poisons measured drop by drop, each tested on stray animals or weakened husbands, their effects recorded in the margins of her leather-bound ledger. She had discovered that a man could be made to suffer for weeks without dying, his mind stripped piece by piece while his body clung to life, and she called this medicine of the soul. It was not enough for her to simply end life. Death was too final, too quick, too lacking in meaning. What Lydia desired was to unravel the man before her, to transform his strength into helpless submission, to peel back the layers of his dignity until only silence remained. To her, each husband was not a partner but a specimen, a canvas upon which she practiced her hidden craft. The jars she sealed and labeled with initials were not the remains of accidents, but trophies of precision. Each jar held fragments of organs suspended in brine. Each wax mold captured the final impression of a man's jaw clenched against pain. She preserved these not as curiosities but as proof of control, evidence that she alone could decide what part of a man's existence would remain in this world after his disappearance. The cellar smelled of iron and damp earth, but Lydia considered it sacred. She lit candles there not for prayer but for observation, their light falling upon restraints built into the wooden beams, devices that looked crude but were designed with exact intention. She had learned from whispers of European methods of discipline, brought across the ocean with settlers who had not forgotten the old ways. Some spoke of monks who used silence as punishment, others of physicians who bled their patients until visions came. Lydia had taken those fragments and shaped them into rituals of her own. When she bound a man in the cellar, she placed wax molds of his teeth beside him, so he would see his own likeness preserved while his body withered. It was not enough for him to feel pain. He needed to understand that even his identity was being claimed and reshaped by her hand. Her cruelty did not scream or rage. It was quiet, as steady as the pulse she measured with her fingers pressed to the wrist of her victims. She watched them closely, noting the moment fear gave way to despair, the instant their prayers fell silent because they realized no salvation would come. Lydia did not kill in haste. She stretched their suffering across nights, administering poisons slowly, sometimes allowing recovery before beginning again, so that hope itself became part of the torment. She wanted their minds to know betrayal by their own bodies, to feel strength dissolve into weakness while their eyes remained open to witness every stage. To the outside world, she remained a woman of virtue, offering church charity with a soft smile. No one who accepted her tonics guessed they were prepared on the same table where organs had been weighed. No one who tasted her teas imagined that the same jars had once held brine-soaked tongues. Her reputation protected her because people believed too easily in the surface of kindness, too willingly in the mask of innocence. And Lydia understood this better than anyone. She knew that cruelty cloaked in virtue is the most unassailable kind, that no one dares accuse the hands that heal of also being the hands that destroy. The truth was that Lydia did not see herself as cruel. In her mind, she was a keeper of order, ensuring that men who entered her house would never rise to dominate, never disrupt the lineage of women bound together by silence and survival. She had shaped her cellar into a sanctuary where power reversed, where the strong were broken by the gentle, and where the echoes of their suffering were captured in glass and wax to endure long after the body was gone. And so the neighbors continued to accept her kindness, to whisper admiration for her soft spirit, never daring to look too long into her eyes. For if they had, they might have seen what lived beneath. The calm gaze of a woman who did not simply kill, but who studied, perfected, and sanctified the very art of unmaking life. The story of the Marlowe widows began not with a cry for help, but with silence. Jonathan Marlowe was the first, a man of ordinary habits who often walked to the river at dusk to cast nets for fish. On the evening he vanished, the town saw him leave with his lantern swinging at his side, his steps steady along the dirt path that curved down toward the water. He never returned. By morning his bed lay untouched, the nets were never found, and the lantern was later discovered in a thicket near the banks, its glass unbroken, the flame snuffed clean. His wife appeared at church the next day, calm as ever, her hair neatly bound, her hands folded in her lap as if she had not lost the man who had shared her table and her bed. She told the neighbors he must have drowned, claimed that he was careless with the river's currents, and her voice carried such certainty that few pressed her further. Yet those who stood near her swore there was not a trace of sorrow in her face, only a peace that seemed rehearsed. As weeks passed, whispers grew. Some said they saw smoke rising from the Marlowe property that very night, thicker than the usual farm burning, carrying a stench so sharp it lingered in the throat. Others claimed they heard faint sounds carried by the wind, a groaning, or perhaps the snapping of wood, though no storm passed and no trees had fallen. The neighbors told themselves it was imagination, yet none could explain the hollow smell that clung to their clothes after standing near the estate past midnight. It was a smell not of wood or grass, but of something heavier, something that hinted at burning flesh. Jonathan's disappearance was not the last. Within a year, another husband, this time a cousin by marriage, vanished after being seen chopping wood near the back orchard. His axe was found buried in the stump where he had left it, but the man himself had dissolved into absence. His widow stood among the women of the family the next day, her black dress already stitched and waiting, her eyes clear as if she had anticipated the role long before the need arose. She explained it away with calm words, saying he had likely wandered off in drink, that he had never been steady in his duties. Yet the man's reputation was the opposite, and the excuse rang hollow. Still, no one challenged the Marlowe women directly. The pattern deepened. Another man failed to return from tending the horses. Another disappeared while fetching water. In each case, the explanation was swift and strangely practiced, as though each widow had rehearsed her story long before tragedy arrived. Their grief was measured, polite, never loud or uncontrolled. Neighbors who attended their morning suppers remarked how quiet the house felt, how the women ate with composure while the seats of their husbands remained conspicuously empty. Behind closed doors, Lydia Marlowe tightened her hold on the family's silence. Each disappearance was not an accident, but a carefully orchestrated ritual. Jonathan had been the first subject of her cellar experiments, the first to be bound to the bone-lined chair she had built with her own hands. His body was weakened with drafts that dulled his strength but left his senses awake, and she measured his responses with the patience of a scholar. His ribs cracked under steady pressure, his blood collected into basins as if it were nothing more than another ingredient for her mixtures. When his final breath left him, Lydia whispered prayers over the body, not for mercy but to consecrate the act, binding it in her mind as both sacred and necessary. With each new victim, she refined her methods. She learned how to keep them alive longer, how to extract from them not only blood but silence. The strange fires seen behind the house were her attempts to strip flesh from bone, to reduce what remained to ash that could be scattered or buried without trace. Yet some of the smoke escaped, carrying its bitter message across the fields to those who dared to notice. The hollow smell that lingered in the night was not an accident of burning wood. It was the odor of marrow and hair, substances that cling in the air long after flames have died. The psychological toll was not on Lydia, but on the men who vanished into her cellar. Each endured days of agony, restrained but awake, their pleas falling against stone walls that echoed them back as if mocking. They realized too late that no rescue would come, that their wives above would not storm the cellar door, but instead prepare their mourning clothes in advance. In that realization lay the cruelest wound, the betrayal of love, the certainty that they had been marked for disappearance long before they even set foot in the house on the hill. And so, the town grew uneasy. They counted the missing, they marked the widows, and yet they said nothing aloud. It was easier to call it misfortune, to pretend that the Marlowe house was cursed rather than confront the truth that something deliberate lived within its walls. Each vanished man became a rumor, a warning carried in hushed tones, but no one dared to challenge Lydia's serene composure. For behind her gentle smile lay a certainty stronger than fear. The knowledge that death could be disguised as accident, and that silence itself was the most reliable accomplice. The cellar beneath the Marlowe estate was no ordinary place of storage. Its stone walls held no barrels of grain or tools for farming, but instead carried the stench of iron and smoke, the thick air of a room that had witnessed too much. Lydia Marlowe had shaped it into a sanctuary of cruelty, a hidden chamber where she believed the order of her household was maintained. Every vanished husband descended here, and every one of them left only as fragments, never whole again. What the neighbors above imagined as accidents or curses were in truth rituals performed with precision, rituals that bled men into silence and turned their bodies into instruments of her twisted devotion. At the center of this hidden world stood the chair. Lydia had crafted it herself from wood and bone, its back reinforced with sharpened antlers, its seat lined with splinters of animal remains she had collected from fields and forests. Each protrusion was carefully placed to pierce skin without delivering instant death, forcing the captive to bleed slowly while still conscious. When a man was bound to it, the weight of his body drove him deeper against the sharp edges, and every attempt at movement brought more tearing, more blood. Yet Lydia did not permit them to scream their way into oblivion too quickly. She had discovered that pain could be stretched like cloth, pulled tighter and tighter if the body was kept awake yet dulled at the edge of collapse. Her tools were set neatly on a nearby table. Opiates brewed from poppy, tinctures that calmed the nerves but sharpened awareness in strange ways, herbs that blurred the line between agony and dream. She administered them with a steady hand, dripping liquid between cracked lips. watching the men's eyes flicker as they realized the horror was not ending, but beginning anew. Their bodies trembled, yet their minds were forced to linger, trapped in a state where every crack of bone and every piercing cut became a memory they could not escape. This was Lydia's art, not merely to kill, but to preserve the consciousness of suffering, to make pain last long enough that it carved itself into the victim's soul. When the moment came, she worked with methodical rhythm. She placed her hands upon the rib cage of the bound man and applied pressure, listening to the faint snapping like twigs in a fire. One by one, ribs gave way under her calculated force, never all at once, never enough to collapse the chest too soon. The cracking sound filled the cellar like a grim hymn, and Lydia whispered over it, her voice steady with prayers that blended scripture with darker fragments of European rites. She recited passages of devotion while invoking words that no priest would dare speak, binding faith and blasphemy into one seamless chant. To her, the breaking of ribs was not cruelty but a ritual act, a way of opening the body so its secrets could be poured into her waiting bowls. The blood was drained with care. Iron vessels sat beneath the chair, positioned so that the slow seep from torn flesh collected drop by drop. Lydia believed this blood was more than fluid. It was the essence of will, of dominance, of the very claim men had always tried to hold over women. By taking it, she convinced herself she was stripping them of power, rendering them hollow while leaving behind only a husk. She stirred the bowls as though mixing a sacred broth, sometimes dipping cloths into the red liquid to anoint the foreheads of the women who assisted in silence. These acts, repeated night after night, turned cruelty into ceremony, transforming murder into what Lydia saw as holy work. For the men, the psychological torment was beyond the body's breaking. The drugs she used blurred their sense of time, trapping them in endless cycles of pain where days and nights dissolved. They tried to beg, their voices hoarse, but each plea was absorbed into the stone walls and echoed back like mockery. They saw their own blood-filling bowls, their ribs split apart under hands that should have healed them. And in those moments they realized their fate had been sealed long before they even stepped into the estate. The betrayal of trust cut deeper than the bone chair ever could. Lydia felt no remorse. Her hands, praised by the town for their charity, were steady even as they wrung life from the men she bound. She told herself it was not murder but purification, that by offering them up in this way she preserved the sanctity of her household. The rituals gave her a sense of control beyond earthly measure, a belief that she was balancing some unseen scale where men's dominance was undone and women's silence was transformed into quiet triumph. Each man became another offering, another name reduced to ash, another secret sealed within jars and wax molds. Above, the estate gleamed white, its windows open to the breeze, its orchards blooming as if untouched by horror. But beneath, the cellar continued its work, the chair never empty for long, the bowls never dry. And with each ritual of bones, Lydia Marlowe perfected her cruelty, drawing from faith, from science, from the darkest corners of old European memory, until her cellar was less a room and more a chapel built on torment. Every disappearance the neighbors whispered about was written first in the cracking of ribs, in the draining of blood, and in the soft prayers spoken by a woman who believed her hands could both heal and destroy with equal grace. Lydia Marlowe's cellar became more than a place of killing. It became a laboratory where cruelty and ritual joined hands with false science. Her killings were no longer only about erasing men from the world, but about reshaping their remains into evidence of her control. She began to view each body as a study, a chance to refine her craft and prove that her hands could do what neither priest nor physician had ever achieved: the preservation of a man's essence under her will alone. It began with teeth. Lydia believed the mouth carried not only words, but fragments of the soul. After the men were bound to her bone-lined chair and drained of blood, she would extract their teeth one by one with iron pliers, placing each on a tray as though cataloging jewels. She then lowered them into shallow bowls filled with a mixture of acid she prepared from minerals and ash. The solution hissed as it consumed the enamel, dissolving what had once been used to speak, to kiss, to bite. She dipped scraps of parchment into the liquid, letting the solution stain the fibers with a dull brown shade. To her, this was not waste but testimony. She called it the voice preserved in silence, convinced that by writing her scriptures upon these sheets, she was binding her own words with the last traces of the men she destroyed. Each page became a grotesque manuscript, infused with what she believed was the essence of speech stripped from their mouths. Her obsessions deepened. The jars that once held only blood or fragments of flesh grew into a grotesque archive. She suspended organs in brine prepared with salt and herbs, labeling each jar with initials carved into the wax seals. Hearts floated like pale fruit in cloudy liquid. Livers sagged at the bottom of glass containers, lungs curled into themselves as if still gasping for air. To any other eye it was a chamber of horror, but to Lydia it was a sacred library of souls. She told herself these were not remains, but specimens of the spirit, preserved as proof that her power reached beyond flesh into the unseen. The cellar shelves became lined with row after row of glass, each containing the silent testimony of a man who had once lived above the soil but now existed only as a suspended shadow under her gaze. Her methods grew more elaborate with each victim. One man she flayed in narrow strips, drying the skin into parchment that she used to bind her ledger. Another she opened at the chest with surgeon's care, extracting the heart while it still quivered faintly. She placed it into a jar of brine before the final beat had stilled, convinced that capturing it in that moment preserved its force forever. The cruelty was not rushed, but performed with exact calculation, each step recorded in her notes as though she were conducting a holy experiment. Her writings mingled prayers with formulas, recording how long an organ could last before the brine clouded, how deep the acid must eat before teeth gave their color to the parchment. She measured suffering with the same devotion a monk might count beads of a rosary. The psychological toll on her victims was unbearable. To feel their teeth stripped from their mouths, to see their own organs pulled from their chests and sealed in jars while their minds clung to awareness. This was torment beyond the body's breaking point. Lydia ensured they watched whenever possible, turning their last moments into spectacles of their own dissection. They understood in the hours before death that their very identity was being claimed and stored, reduced to specimens catalogued by a woman who spoke to them in tones of prayer while dismantling their existence piece by piece. Yet Lydia never saw herself as monstrous. In her mind, she was advancing the work of both science and faith, combining the knowledge whispered by European physicians with the scripture she twisted to her own design. She believed she was uncovering the true nature of man, proving that what gave him authority could be preserved, controlled, and displayed like relics of a forgotten saint. The jars became her reliquary, the acid-stained parchments her gospel, the brine her baptismal water. Each killing fed not only her need for power, but her growing conviction that she was chosen to reveal a higher order through cruelty. Above the cellar, the world continued as though untouched. The estate thrived, its orchards heavy with fruit, its women serene in their black garments. But beneath, Lydia was building a grotesque museum of anatomy and faith, where every vanished husband became a chapter in her private scripture. Her devotion had shifted from mere silence to permanence. She no longer cared only that the men disappeared. She wanted them to endure under her control, reduced to specimens that testified to her dominance long after their voices were gone. And so the cellar grew heavier with jars and pages, the shelves bending under the weight of her experiments. Lydia moved among them like a priestess, touching the glass with reverence, whispering prayers into the cloudy brine. To her, these were not trophies of death, but relics of revelation. To the world above, they were simply missing men. But in the cellar of the Marlowe estate, their souls had been claimed, catalogued, and sealed forever by hands that healed in daylight and destroyed in the dark. The land around the Marlowe estate stretched wide, its fields rich with corn and tobacco, its orchards heavy with fruit. To neighbors, it seemed the very soil was blessed, yielding more than any other farm in the county. But those who passed too close at night felt something wrong in the air, as though the ground itself breathed with secrets. The harvest was not born of sunlight and rain alone. Lydia Marlowe had begun to treat the fields as an extension of her cellar, a place where the rituals of death fed the roots of her prosperity. When the killings left her with bodies too many to conceal within stone walls, Lydia turned to the earth itself as her accomplice. She no longer buried her husbands in shallow, hurried graves. Instead, she devised a method both symbolic and cruel. She placed them upright beneath the soil, bound and mutilated, transforming them into grotesque guardians of the land. To her, their corpses were not refuse but offerings, planted like seeds of flesh whose decay would enrich the crops and ensure the survival of her house. Each burial was prepared with precision. The men, broken from her cellar rituals, were carried into the fields under cover of darkness. Their tongues were cut from their mouths before burial, stuffed into their own hands, or placed in jars of salt that Lydia stored in the cellar. She believed speech was dangerous, that in death as in life a man's voice could still accuse her before God. By tearing it away, she silenced them for eternity. Their eyes were sewn shut with coarse horsehair, crude black stitches holding the lids closed. Lydia told herself this kept them blind in the afterlife, unable to see the path back to accuse her at judgment. They would remain mute and blind beneath the soil, stripped of the very faculties that gave them authority over women. The process of planting them upright carried its own cruelty. She dug narrow pits just wide enough to force the broken bodies into a vertical stance. The bound men were lowered feet first, pressed into the earth like fence posts. Soil was shoveled in around them until only their scalps showed, and then those too were covered, leaving the ground smooth above. To anyone walking by, the fields looked untouched, yet beneath the surface the dead stood in rows like silent crops. Lydia called them guardians of fertility, convinced that their decay would seep into the soil and strengthen the harvest. She walked among the planted dead as if tending an orchard, whispering blessings that mingled scripture with the darker phrases she had long adopted. The psychological toll of this practice was deliberate. In many cases, the men were not fully dead when they were lowered into the pits. Lydia had perfected the balance of drugs and restraint so that consciousness lingered even as bodies failed. The victims felt the earth pressed down upon them, heard the thud of shovels covering their chests, tasted soil forced into their throats as they struggled for one last breath. They realized in their final moments that they were not being buried to rest but to stand forever beneath the ground, mutilated and voiceless. Their terror bled into the soil along with their bodies, and Lydia fed on the certainty that their final awareness had been one of betrayal and horror. For the women of the estate, the fields became sacred ground. They moved through the rows of corn, knowing that beneath each stalk stood the remains of a man who had once held their name. The scarecrows Lydia erected were not simple guardians of the harvest, but markers placed above each planted body. Straw-filled effigies with arms outstretched as though mimicking the bound men below. When the wind rustled the clothes of these figures, it seemed to carry the echo of muffled cries rising from the earth itself. The women walked past them in silence, some averting their eyes, others finding a strange comfort in knowing that the land was theirs because the men had been turned into part of it. The neighbors noticed the oddities. They saw that the Marlowe fields never faltered, that no drought or pestilence touched their crops. They smelled the faint, sickly odor that drifted after rain, a scent not of wet earth but of something rotting far beneath. They remarked on the scarecrows, too many for one farm, standing at precise distances as though placed by measured hand. Yet no one dared to question aloud why no man remained at the estate to work the land. The widows kept the fields alive, and that was explanation enough, at least for those unwilling to uncover the truth. For Lydia, each harvest proved her righteousness. She saw the bounty as confirmation that her rituals worked, that the mutilated bodies buried upright had indeed become guardians of fertility. She convinced herself that God had accepted her offerings, that the silence of the neighbors was itself a form of blessing. The cellar gave her control over the body, but the fields gave her dominion over life itself, for she believed she had found the secret of feeding the soil with souls. The estate prospered while the ground grew heavy with the standing dead. The fields shimmered with health, but beneath every row, beneath every scarecrow's shadow, the truth festered. The Marlowe farm was not a place of growth but of burial, where the line between harvest and grave was erased by a woman who believed cruelty could be sanctified if it bore fruit. And still the neighbors remained silent, choosing not to see what lay beneath the soil that fed them all. As the years passed and the husbands of the Marlowe estate disappeared one by one, the house did not weaken. Instead, it grew tighter in its silence, its women bound together not by grief but by a strange, unspoken communion. At first, they were pitied. The townsfolk called them cursed, a family of women made tragic by some misfortune they could not escape. But pity did not last. As the number of widows grew and their composure remained unnervingly calm, whispers shifted. Were they victims? Or had they embraced something darker, something that required their husband's erasure? Inside the walls of the house, Lydia drew them close. She understood that fear alone could not hold women together, but ritual could. She gave them tasks, symbols, and ceremonies that turned their widowhood into a role they were forced to play. Each widow sewed garments in secret, gowns stitched not with ordinary thread, but with strands dipped in the blood of the men taken to the cellar. Lydia collected the blood in bowls, letting it dry into clotted strands, which she then twisted into cords. These cords became threads, woven into hems and cuffs, binding each widow literally to the sacrifice beneath the soil. When the gowns were complete, they were not worn in daylight, but only in the cellar under the light of tallow candles that flickered against the jars of organs and shelves of bone. In these secret gatherings, the cellar changed. It was no longer just a chamber of torture, but a chapel of silence, where the widows stood together in their blood-stitched garments, their faces pale, their eyes reflecting the glow of flame. They gathered around the bone chair where another husband always sat in the final stages of his unraveling. His muffled cries, his rattling breath became the rhythm to which their ceremony moved. Lydia led them in humming, long, low tones that filled the air and drowned the cries into a dull undercurrent. The sound was neither hymn nor song, but something in between, a drone of unity, a vibration that turned suffering into ritual. The victims heard it as they died, and it broke them more deeply than the physical torment. To see the women they had once called wives or kin standing in candlelight, humming over their slow collapse, was a cruelty beyond measure. It told them that no rescue was coming, that those who should have wept for them had instead become part of the ritual consuming them. Their last moments were filled not only with pain, but with the knowledge that love itself had been stolen, replaced with a chorus of voices humming them into silence. For Lydia, this was not madness but completion. She believed no ritual could hold power unless it was shared, unless many voices carried it together. By turning the women into participants, she erased doubt and bound them to her control. They became accomplices, whether by choice or necessity, their silence deepened by the fear of exposure and the intoxication of belonging to something larger than grief. Each gathering was a ceremony of power disguised as mourning, and the cellar was the stage where suffering was converted into unity. The garments stitched with blood became heavier with each ritual, each thread a reminder that life had been taken to sustain the family's strange order. The widows wore them with trembling at first, then with acceptance, and finally with a grim pride. Their humming grew steadier, louder, until it seemed the very stone walls of the cellar vibrated with their voices. Lydia listened with satisfaction, convinced that the sound was more than music. She believed it masked the cries from God's ears, that it turned torture into devotion, and that by drowning out the suffering of men, the women were sanctifying themselves. The town began to notice the gatherings only in fragments. Light flickered from the cellar windows at odd hours, shadows moving in patterns that looked like processions. Some swore they heard the faint hum of voices carried on the night air, a low resonance that unsettled livestock and made dogs bark without cause. The neighbors tried to explain it away as wind or the creak of the old house, but unease spread. They had once pitied the widows, but now their calmness, their unity seemed unnatural. The question took root in every whispered conversation. Were these women trapped, or were they choosing to remain in the orbit of something unspeakable? No answer came. The Marlowe women appeared in church as always, their dresses plain, their hands folded, their faces smooth. But beneath the fabric, the threads of blood remained, stitched close to their skin, reminders of the men buried standing in the fields, and the rituals that made silence a kind of song. The townsfolk could not see it, but in the cellar at night the widow's choir grew louder, their voices weaving over the cries of the dying until suffering itself became music. And so the line blurred, victim and accomplice, grief and ritual, silence and hymn. The house on the hill no longer hid a single psychopath, but a choir of women bound together by blood and fear, their harmony masking the horrors that still unfolded in the chair at the center of the cellar. By the spring of 1839, the Marlowe estate had already fallen into rumor heavy enough to choke the air around it. Men vanished. Widows grew serene, and the neighbors whispered without daring to act. Yet the silence of the town could not protect the estate forever. It was a traveler, not a neighbor, who first disturbed the calm, a physician named Dr. Elijah Warren, whose wandering practice carried him across Kentucky in search of both coin and reputation. He had heard of Lydia Marlowe long before he saw her house, her name spoken with admiration by women who swore her remedies saved them when no other cure would. Intrigued by a healer whose fame rivaled his own, Warren requested entry, believing he might learn from her craft or expose its limits. What he found instead was a chamber of horrors dressed in the clothing of science. Lydia welcomed him with her usual grace, her hands folded neatly, her voice carrying the weight of kindness. She showed him her garden, where herbs grew in thick rows and her shelves of tinctures carefully labeled. To the untrained eye, it was the collection of a gifted apothecary, but Warren's training saw the difference. The jars did not hold simple remedies. They carried residues of minerals that burned the tongue, metals that poisoned the blood. He noted strange stains on her parchment, a brown hue too organic to come from ink, and he watched the flicker of her eyes as he asked questions she brushed away with practiced calm. He felt the air of concealment but could not yet name it. It was when he descended to the cellar under the guise of curiosity about her preparation methods that Warren began to understand. There the air was heavy with rot, the stone slick with dampness. He found shelves lined with wax molds, each shaped into the arch of human jaws. Their impressions unmistakable. The teeth captured in wax were not animal nor decorative. They were human, every curve and gap preserved with disturbing precision. He touched one, the wax cool under his fingers, and realized they were trophies. Mouths stripped from men who no longer existed above the ground. Further into the cellar, his lantern revealed a pit. Its walls were coated in lime, the white powder clinging to the stone in uneven streaks. At its base lay fragments of bone, bleached and brittle, mixed with the darkened remains of marrow that had boiled away in chemical heat. Warren knew this process. He had seen lime used in battlefields to strip flesh from soldiers who could not be buried whole. But here it was no accident of war. This was deliberate, a system designed to erase bodies with the same cold efficiency as a surgeon cutting away disease. It was in that moment he understood. Lydia's killings were not the chaos of madness, but the method of someone who cloaked her domination in the language of science and the gestures of faith. Warren's heart pounded, yet his training told him to remain composed. He questioned her gently, masking horror with curiosity, but he could not contain the tremor in his voice when he asked why she kept such things. Lydia smiled softly, her face serene, and told him these were studies, that she preserved the essence of men as part of her devotion to God's greater order. She spoke as though describing simple remedies, yet her words carried the certainty of someone who had long convinced herself that cruelty was truth. The doctor left the cellar shaken, his mind burning with images he could not dismiss. That night, in the small room given to him above, he began writing. His journal recorded everything: the wax molds, the lime pit, the jars of organs, the calm voice of a woman who justified dismemberment as devotion. He wrote with urgency, as if his pen alone could protect him, as if naming the truth might give it power to resist. Yet Lydia was not blind to his unease. She watched the tremor of his hands at supper, the hollow look in his eyes. She knew when a man had seen too much, and she never allowed witnesses to carry her secrets into the world alive. Within days, Warren was gone. Lydia told the town he had succumbed to a fever, an outbreak that swept through travelers that season. She buried an empty box as his coffin, allowing whispers of disease to swallow the truth. Few questioned it. Death was common, and physicians often fell victim to the same sickness they fought. The Marlowe estate moved on, its silence restored. But Lydia did not know that Warren had left behind more than whispers. His journal, hidden with a local innkeeper in town, survived his staged death. The pages spoke with clarity. They described not a cursed family, but a deliberate system, a ritual of torture cloaked as healing. A woman who preserved jaws and organs as if they were scripture. He wrote of the cellar not as a place of madness, but as a cathedral where dominance was studied with scientific devotion. Though the journal lay unread for years, it became the first fracture in the silence, proof that what had been hidden as misfortune was in truth something chosen, calculated, and sanctified by the gentle hands of Lydia Marlowe. It began with smoke curling out of the upper windows just before dawn, a thick black plume that rolled over the ridge and cast a shadow across the Marlowe fields. By the time neighbors saw the flames and rushed toward the estate, half the house was already burning. Fire roared through the wood, consuming walls that had long hidden the silence of vanished men. Sparks rained onto the orchard, and the sound of collapsing beams echoed across the valley like thunder. Yet inside there were no cries for help, no frantic escape. The Marlowe women stood together in the yard, their gowns black against the glow, their faces calm as the flames devoured the home they had guarded for nearly a decade. Some whispered psalms, others hummed the same low tones that once filled the cellar, as though the destruction was not tragedy but ceremony. The neighbors rushed with buckets of water, forming lines to fight the blaze. But Lydia raised no plea for assistance. She watched with steady eyes, her daughters and kin beside her, as if this fire were a natural continuation of her work. When at last the flames weakened, leaving only smoking ruins and skeletal beams, the people of the valley entered the wreckage and found what should never have been seen. Beneath the collapsed floorboards where the fire had eaten deepest lay charred shapes that were not wood. Blackened bone, twisted and fused, jutted from the ash. Skulls cracked from the heat stared upward, their sockets empty, their jaws frozen wide as though still caught in the last gasp of torment. Dozens of remains were uncovered in shallow pits and stone-lined cavities beneath the house. The fire had not consumed them completely, and what it left was unmistakable. These were not ancestors resting in peace. These were men hidden away, their bodies burned but not cleansed, their agony preserved in bone. The neighbors recoiled, horrified. The fire had revealed what they had whispered for years but never dared to confront. The disappearances were no curse, no misfortune of the family's bloodline. They were deliberate, their truth buried beneath the very foundation of the estate. Yet even in the face of exposed evidence, the Marlowe women did not break. As the townsfolk uncovered skulls, ribs, and hands fused together in ash, the widows began to sing. Their voices rose in unison, soft and steady, carrying psalms into the smoky air. The sound was chilling, a hymn of composure where grief should have torn their throats raw. Some neighbors joined in out of confusion, others fled, unable to endure the sight of women singing over charred bone. When authorities were summoned, the investigation began with urgency. Sheriffs and judges arrived, their boots sinking into blackened ash, their faces pale as they counted the remains. Witnesses swore they had seen men buried in those foundations, their flesh boiled away with lime, their voices silenced. But as the weeks passed, the urgency faltered. Records disappeared, names vanished from ledgers, and testimonies were dismissed as exaggerations of hysteria. Those with power in the county had long been tied to the Marlowe family by favors, debts, and secrets. Lydia's wealth bought silence as effectively as her rituals had bought control. Officials who once swore they would bring justice began to mutter of accidents, of old graves disturbed, of tragedy mistaken for malice. The fire had uncovered the bones, but it had not uncovered a crime that the law was willing to recognize. The neighbors, too, fell back into silence. For a few weeks they had spoken with fire in their voices, demanding answers, demanding justice. But as no arrests came, their words softened. Fear crept in, reminding them that to accuse the Marlowe women was to risk their own safety. Whispers replaced shouts, and soon even whispers faded. The valley settled back into uneasy quiet, as though the fire had never burned at all. Yet the estate did not disappear. Within a year, its charred skeleton was torn down and rebuilt, the walls rising again over the blackened foundation. Fresh whitewash covered the new timbers, new shutters gleamed in the sunlight, and the orchards bloomed once more. To outsiders, it looked like renewal, a family rebuilding after misfortune. But to those who had seen the bones, who had smelled the stench of burning marrow, the new house was only a mask over a grave. The land itself could not forget. For years after the fire, the scent lingered. Each rain seemed to draw it up again from the soil, a sweet, sickly odor that clung to the air like rot. Farmers passing by claimed it made their stomachs turn, and livestock avoided grazing near the ridge. Even children too young to know the full story whispered that the house smelled wrong, that the wind carried with it the breath of the dead. The widows ignored it, moving through their rebuilt halls as though the smell were nothing more than smoke trapped in the timbers. But the neighbors knew what it was: the marrow of men cooked into the soil, a stench no fire could cleanse. For Lydia, the fire was not failure but transformation. It had burned away evidence but left her power intact, proving to her that nothing could break the silence she commanded. She interpreted the blaze as judgment past and overcome, a trial by flame that she and her family had survived without punishment. Where others saw horror in the exposed bones, she saw confirmation that her rituals endured even through fire. And so she continued, rebuilding not only her house but her faith in the righteousness of her cruelty. The valley, however, was never the same. Though the law dismissed the remains, though records vanished into silence, the memory of the fire remained etched in every mind. Neighbors avoided the estate after dusk. Children crossed themselves when they passed the fields, and the orchard stood untouched by outsiders who feared the fruit grew fat on buried flesh. The Marlowe house gleamed white again, but beneath its foundations the truth remained sealed in soil and ash. And in the nights that followed, when the wind blew just right, the townsfolk swore they could still hear faint singing carried across the ridge, the sound of widows humming psalms over the embers of bones. Time did not bury the Marlowe horrors as completely as Lydia had hoped. Though the house was rebuilt and its walls painted white again, though generations rose and passed without speaking of what had once burned beneath its foundations, fragments of the truth survived like smoldering coals hidden deep within ash. They did not blaze openly, but they glowed, faint and enduring, waiting for the right breath of air to stir them alive. Decades later, when old papers surfaced in church archives and when men digging wells uncovered jars clouded with brine and floating fragments, the silence cracked. What had been whispered as curse and rumor was revealed in partial light, and yet the full truth remained blurred, as if the past itself resisted being uncovered. The church records were the first to surface, unsealed by clerks long after all who had lived through the Marlowe years were gone. They showed marriages entered without graves to close them, widows appearing in pew after pew with no death certificates for their husbands. The registers carried lines of neat handwriting, names followed by blanks where dates of passing should have been written. In other families, burials were marked with scripture and rites, but in the Marlowe book, silence filled the space. The clerks who unsealed the record whispered among themselves that it was not a book of family history, but a ledger of erasure. Then came the jars. In the 1870s, a drought struck the valley, forcing farmers to dig deeper into abandoned wells. One of them, a boy not yet grown into manhood, pulled up a heavy clay jar sealed with wax. It cracked open on the rocks, spilling cloudy liquid in what appeared to be a withered organ, its edges preserved in salt. Soon more jars were found, hidden in stone shafts or buried beneath collapsed barns. Each contained fragments of human remains suspended in brine that still carried the acrid smell of rot. The discoveries spread fear through the county. Some called them medical specimens, remnants of experiments carried out by a woman ahead of her time. Others called them relics of a cult, the proof of a devotion that had twisted faith into ritual slaughter. No matter the explanation, the effect was the same. The Marlowe silence bled back into the present, staining memory with horror. Lawyers and historians searching through these fragments began to link them to changes in inheritance law that appeared around the same time as Lydia's dominance. They noted how Kentucky's courts suddenly required stronger proof of a husband's death before a widow could claim his property. How new rules demanded public record of burial or testimony from outside witnesses. The timing was no coincidence. Though never written openly in legislation, the shadow of the Marlowe estate hung over those changes. It was as if the law itself had been reshaped by fear. Not fear of famine or war, but fear of women who could turn silence into power by erasing the men who once held legal control of land and name. Even as the fragments surfaced, interpretation remained divided. Some scholars called Lydia Marlowe a scientist whose grotesque work paralleled experiments later carried out in distant laboratories. A woman whose preservation of organs and bones foreshadowed the medical sciences of pathology. They called her a mind corrupted by secrecy but not without vision. Others insisted she was no scientist but a cult leader who twisted her family into accomplices, whose cellar ceremonies blurred hymns with mutilation, whose rituals of burial turned fertile land into graveyard soil. To these voices, she was not ahead of her time but beyond the limits of sanity, cloaking murder in the garments of faith and devotion. The truth remained blurred because the evidence itself was fragmented. The church records gave silence but no confession. The jars carried horror but no explanation. The inheritance laws hinted at fear but did not name its cause. Even Dr. Warren's journal, uncovered after his death, was incomplete, its pages damaged, some missing entirely. Together they painted not a clear portrait but a shattered mirror, one in which the image of Lydia Marlowe appeared both as healer and destroyer, both scientist and cultist, both woman of grace and predator of souls. What endured most powerfully was not the detail, but the weight of silence. The valley learned that evil does not always scream or declare itself. Sometimes it wears the mask of innocence, the calm hands of a healer, the folded posture of a widow in church. Sometimes it thrives not because it is hidden perfectly, but because no one dares to speak, no one dares to accuse. Silence itself became Lydia's greatest accomplice, carrying her rituals forward without interruption, allowing her cellar to become a cathedral of cruelty without resistance. Generations later, the orchard still bore fruit, but children refused to eat from it, swearing that the taste was wrong, as if the sweetness carried rot beneath its skin. Families spoke of the ridge in hushed tones, telling their children not to wander near, for the soil was heavy with those buried upright, their tongues cut, their eyes sewn shut. The rebuilt house stood for years, but even painted white it could not erase the memory of blackened beams and skulls cracked by fire. The land itself seemed marked, its beauty twisted by what lay beneath. And so the legacy of the Marlowe family lived on, not in monuments or memorials, but in laws rewritten, in whispers that spread beyond Kentucky, in the uneasy knowledge that horror can take root in silence and grow unchecked when wrapped in the appearance of grace. Lydia had long since gone to her grave, but her shadow stretched forward, shaping fear and suspicion for decades after. To some she was a warning, to others a symbol, to all a reminder that evil is most dangerous when it hides in plain sight. The question remains even now when the story is told and retold in fragments. Could such horrors rise again? Could another family, another house conceal its rituals beneath the guise of devotion and charity? The truth is uncomfortable, but history offers its answer in the echo of silence. For evil thrives not because it is rare, but because it is often overlooked, disguised as normal, sheltered by those unwilling to see. What do you think? Could it happen again, hidden behind the whitewashed walls of another house, beneath the quiet hum of another family's silence?